At 30,000 feet, a simple request for dinner should have been routine. But what happens when that request is met not with service, but with silence, and worse, with prejudice? What if the person being denied wasn't just another passenger, but the very scientist whose invention fed the entire airline industry? On Flight 482, Dr. Maya Ellington, a woman of quiet strength and brilliance, asked for the same meal as those around her. Instead, she was lied to, dismissed, and threatened. In that moment, she faced a choice: accept the humiliation in silence, or act. What no one on that plane realized, not the smug attendant, not the dismissive purser, not even the CEO asleep in his London penthouse, was that Maya Ellington carried within her the power to bring their billion-dollar empire to its knees. How does a single act of disrespect spiral into global chaos? How does dignity, when defended, echo from one airplane seat to boardrooms across the world? This is the story of a quiet storm at 30,000 feet and the reckoning it unleashed. If stories like this move you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Now, let's begin. The sound of boarding announcements echoed faintly across the polished marble of Los Angeles International Airport. It was late afternoon, and the golden haze of a California sun filtered through the wide glass windows of the international terminal. Travelers rushed past in every direction, luggage wheels humming over the tile, voices a patchwork of languages blending into the chaotic music of transit. In the midst of it all, Dr. Maya Ellington walked with quiet composure. She wasn't the kind of traveler who drew immediate attention. She wasn't dripping in designer labels or trailed by assistants juggling suitcases. Instead, her presence was marked by a calm elegance that stood out precisely because she didn't demand that it be noticed. She carried one sleek black leather carry-on and a slim laptop case slung across her shoulder. Her attire was understated but refined dark tailored jeans, a cream silk blouse, and a soft gray blazer. Her hair, long and textured, was gathered neatly into a low bun that spoke of both practicality and grace. At 39, Maya Ellington had built a life of substance. She wasn't merely successful. She was formidable. The founder and CEO of Nutrivita Systems. Her biotech firm had quietly revolutionized global food preservation with a proprietary process that had changed the way perishable meals were stored and transported. Airlines, luxury cruise lines, and international hotel chains depended on her company's technology. They didn't advertise it, but behind every elegantly plated meal served thousands of feet in the air or hundreds of miles from a port was her science. Without Nutrivita's system, their luxury menus would collapse into soggy mediocrity. Yet as she moved through the terminal toward her gate, she looked like any other professional woman embarking on a long journey. That was how Maya preferred it. Her power didn't live in appearances. It lived in patents, contracts, and the quiet certainty that her work had reshaped industries. Still, she liked being invisible sometimes. It gave her space to observe, to think, to breathe. Her destination today was Paris. The flight was a non-stop across the Atlantic, a little under 11 hours. She had been invited to give the keynote at a major food technology conference, a recognition of both her scientific innovation and her growing influence in international business circles. But it wasn't just work that drew her to Paris. Maya had promised herself a few days afterward to wander the galleries she loved, to stand again before Monet's lilies and Chagall's stained glass, to lose herself in art before the demands of running a company swallowed her whole once more. By the time she reached the first-class boarding lane, the terminal had grown busier, a tide of travelers clustering around the gate agents. Maya presented her boarding pass with a polite smile, and the attendant scanned it quickly, wishing her a pleasant flight. She thanked them softly and stepped into the jet bridge. The moment she entered the first-class cabin of Atlantic Skyways Flight 918, she felt the shift in atmosphere. The hum of the aircraft was muffled, the lighting soft, the air scented faintly with something floral and expensive. The seats weren't really seats at all, but private pods, each with its own sliding door, designed to cocoon passengers in luxury. The space was calm, almost reverent, as if the chaos of the terminal had been left behind. Maya slid into her seat. 2-0. She set her carry-on into the overhead bin and her laptop case by her feet, then lowered herself into the wide leather chair. The seat embraced her in comfort, a world away from the rigid lines of economy. She leaned back, closed her eyes for a moment, and let the quiet hum of the cabin wrap around her. For the first time in 3 days, she exhaled without tension in her shoulders. The past week had been relentless. Negotiations with European partners, back-to-back investor calls, endless technical reviews. Success was thrilling, but it was also exhausting. There were nights when she lay awake, replaying conversations, recalculating risks, planning the next 5 moves like a chess master who could never stop playing. She was tired, not weak, but deeply, profoundly tired. And in this small sanctuary of first class, she wanted something simple, a meal, a glass of champagne, and the steady hush of hours of uninterrupted sleep. The other passengers began to filter in. Across the aisle in 2D sat a woman draped in jewels, her perfume already wafting across the narrow space. The man in 1A, a tall, silver-haired businessman, settled with practiced ease into his pod, immediately pulling out his phone to dictate notes. Maya glanced at them briefly, then returned her focus to adjusting her seat and scrolling through the in-flight entertainment menu. As the cabin filled, the lead flight attendant made her way down the aisle. She introduced herself crisply as Karen Whitmore, her voice clipped, professional, but with a smile that barely brushed her lips. She paused to engage warmly with the man in 1A, asking about his destination, sharing a small laugh at something he said. She admired the sparkling bracelet on the wrist of the woman in 2D, complimenting her taste. When Karen reached Maya's seat, the smile dimmed into formality. "Welcome aboard, ma'am," she said, her tone polite but flat. "Can I offer you something to drink before takeoff?" Maya returned the courtesy with genuine warmth. "Yes, thank you. A glass of champagne would be lovely." Karen gave a small nod, almost perfunctory, and moved on without another word. A few minutes later, Maya's champagne appeared on the small tray table. No smile, no eye contact. The glass was set down swiftly, as though checking off a box. Maya noticed the difference immediately. She had lived long enough to recognize the quiet sting of being marked as an outsider. It wasn't loud, it wasn't obvious. It was subtle. A shift in tone, a missing courtesy, a smile withheld, a message, almost invisible, that whispered, "You don't quite belong here." She took a sip of the champagne, letting the bubbles fizz gently across her tongue. She refused to let it bother her. She had known this kind of dismissal in boardrooms, in academic halls, in quiet corners of society where expectations had already been written against her. Petty slights, she reminded herself, were beneath her attention. Her energy was reserved for greater battles, the ones that truly mattered. As the aircraft doors closed and the engines roared to life, Maya felt the vibration carry through the cabin, the promise of transatlantic flight beginning. She leaned her head against the seat, closed her eyes again, and let herself drift into the rhythm of takeoff. Outside, the runway blurred into streaks of light, Inside, her world seemed still, calm, suspended. She didn't know it yet, but within hours, this calm would fracture. A single dismissive act, rooted in prejudice, would ignite a storm that would ripple far beyond the confines of this aircraft. The woman who sat quietly in seat 2A, sipping champagne, would soon become the epicenter of a corporate earthquake. For now, though, she allowed herself to rest. The climb out of Los Angeles was smooth, the late afternoon sky melting from gold to a deepening blue as the Boeing 787 banked over the Pacific. The cabin lights dimmed to a warm glow, giving the space the hushed atmosphere of an exclusive lounge. Dr. Maya Ellington stretched her legs, appreciating the comfort of her pod. The leather was soft, the design carefully engineered to make passengers feel like they were cocooned from the world outside. She glanced briefly around the cabin. First class on a transatlantic route was a world of its own, a theater of subtle performances, where people who were used to power and privilege carried themselves with the same assurance they wore their suits. The man in 1A, whom Maya had noticed earlier, was now leaning back in his seat with a scotch in hand. His salt and pepper hair and tailored pinstripe suit made him look every inch the corporate executive. His voice carried just enough that Maya caught snippets of his conversation with the flight attendant who had served him. He was speaking about mergers, about valuations, about a deal that would shake up the whole sector. Across the aisle in 2D, the jeweled woman had already removed her heels and was reclining in her seat, her bracelets jingling softly as she adjusted the settings on her entertainment screen. Her perfume hung in the air, expensive and floral, and every gesture she made suggested she was used to being admired. Maya guessed she was perhaps the wife of a financier, or perhaps wealthy in her own right. Either way, she radiated entitlement in a way that seemed effortless. Maya pulled out a book from her bag, a slim volume of poetry she had been saving for this trip. It was one of her rituals when she traveled to lose herself in words that had nothing to do with business, science, or negotiations. She traced her fingers lightly over the page as she read, letting the rhythm calm her. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The quiet was interrupted when a younger attendant arrived at her seat. His name tag read Daniel Ruiz. His smile was genuine, and his tone carried warmth that contrasted with Karen's brittle efficiency. "Good evening, Dr. Ellington," he said softly. "I just wanted to make sure you were comfortable. Would you like me to explain the seat functions or the menu for tonight's service?" Maya looked up, slightly surprised by the kindness. "Thank you, Daniel. I think I'm all set with the seat, but I would appreciate a quick overview of the dinner menu later." "Of course," he said with a nod, his expression sincere. "We'll be serving shortly after we reach cruising altitude. If you need anything in the meantime, please don't hesitate to let me know." When he left, Maya felt a faint smile tug at the corners of her mouth. She had learned to notice these small moments of humanity in service encounters, because they often illuminated the deeper truth of the environment. Daniel was kind without effort. Karen, on the other hand, had already established her chilly distance. It was like standing in sunlight and shadow at the same time. As the plane leveled out, the seatbelt sign switched off with a soft chime. Passengers moved slightly, stretching, reaching for magazines or headphones. Karen reappeared, moving down the aisle with the practiced stride of someone who had done this routine countless times. Her blonde hair was tightly lacquered, and her expression carried that air of forced politeness that never quite reached her eyes. When she stopped at the businessman in 1A, her demeanor changed completely. She leaned in, her smile wide and engaging. "Another scotch for you, Mr. "Harper," she asked, her voice lilting almost playfully. "Yes, please. Make it neat," he said, and she laughed lightly at something he added about the long night ahead. Karen then turned to the woman in 2D, admiring her jewelry with open appreciation. "That's such a beautiful necklace," she said, her tone dripping with admiration. "Did you pick it up in Milan?" The woman smiled, pleased with the attention. "Rome. Actually, last spring." Karen clapped her hands together softly. "Exquisite taste. I'll get your Chardonnay right away." Maya observed the interactions carefully, not with jealousy, but with a kind of anthropological detachment. She saw the differences in tone, the warmth that blossomed for some and withered for others. When Karen finally arrived at her seat, the transformation was striking. The smile faded to something perfunctory, mechanical. "Would you like another drink?" Karen asked, her voice clipped, eyes glancing past Maya rather than at her. "I'm fine for now. Thank you," Maya replied gently, though inside she noted the shift. She had catalogued enough experiences like this to recognize the pattern. It wasn't always overt. Sometimes it was as simple as a smile withheld, an absence of courtesy that everyone else received. Sometimes it was in the smallest gestures that the truth revealed itself. She returned to her book, but her concentration was broken. Her thoughts wandered instead to the countless moments in her life when she had been made to feel like an intruder in spaces she had earned her way into. The boardroom, where she had been asked whose assistant she was. The academic conference, where someone assumed she was part of the catering staff. The venture capital pitch where an investor had praised her poise, before questioning if she had the stamina to lead. It wasn't bitterness that colored her thoughts. It was clarity. She had spent years learning how to stand her ground without raising her voice, how to prove her worth again and again in a world that seemed determined to underestimate her. Dinner service began with the clinking of cutlery and the faint aroma of food drifting from the galley. Daniel returned, this time with a menu printed on heavy paper, embossed with the airline's logo. He explained the choices with the same polite warmth he had shown earlier: a citrus-glazed salmon, a prime rib with rosemary juice, or a wild mushroom truffle risotto. Maya's eyes lingered on the salmon. It sounded light, refreshing, the perfect complement to a long flight where sleep was as valuable as the meal itself. She folded the menu neatly and placed it on her tray, ready for when Karen would return to take her order. Around her, conversations ebbed and flowed. Mr. Harper in 1A was still talking business, his voice carrying above the hum of the engines. The woman in 2D was laughing at something Daniel had said, her bracelets jingling like bells. Maya felt herself settle into the rhythm of the cabin, though there was an undercurrent of unease she couldn't shake. It was subtle, like the tension in a room before a storm, the kind of feeling you could almost dismiss, but not quite. Something in her told her this flight would not be the quiet retreat she had hoped for. Something told her the calm surface was only a mask, and beneath it, a confrontation was waiting. She closed her eyes briefly, centering herself with a deep breath. Whatever was coming, she would meet it with the same strength she always had, not with rage, not with noise, but with the quiet, unshakable force of a woman who knew exactly who she was. The stage was set. The players had all taken their places. The curtain was about to rise. The cabin had settled into a soft rhythm. The hum of the engines a steady backdrop to quiet conversations and the faint rustle of magazines. Dr. Maya Ellington had finished her champagne and returned to her book. Though her eyes wandered more often to the people around her than to the page in front of her, she had always been a keen observer, trained by years of noticing details that others overlooked, details that often revealed more truth than what was spoken aloud. Karen returned with the confidence of someone who believed the cabin was her stage. She carried a tray of drinks, smiling at Mr. Harper in 1A as though they were old friends. Her voice softened, warm and conversational, when she leaned over his seat to set down a fresh glass of scotch. "Another neat pour for you, sir," she said, her tone almost playful. "Perfect. Thank you." "Karen," he replied, and the two shared a brief exchange that sounded more like two colleagues at a private club than an attendant serving a passenger. From across the aisle, Ms. Davenport in 2D raised her manicured hand. The diamonds on her wrist caught the light as she called out, "Karen, could I have another Chardonnay when you get the chance?" "Of course. Mrs. Davenport," Karen said, her voice rich with admiration, as though the request were an honor to fulfill. When Karen approached Maya's seat, however, the warmth drained away. The smile faded. The tone shifted back into something efficient, cold, and transactional. "Would you like another champagne?" she asked, eyes already flicking down her notepad, as if she were ticking off a list. Maya studied her for a moment. She recognized the subtle dissonance in tone. The warmth that had flowed so easily for others was absent here. She smiled politely, her voice steady. "I'll just have water for now." "Thank you." Karen gave the smallest of nods and moved on without a word of acknowledgement. It was a small thing, just a glass of water placed on a tray table, but Maya felt the familiar sting. She had encountered these moments countless times before. They never came in the form of a shouted insult or overt exclusion. Instead, they crept in through differences in tone, in body language, in the things said to others, but withheld from her. They came in moments where humanity was rationed, portioned more generously for some, more sparingly for others. She reached for her book again, but found the words swimming on the page. Her thoughts drifted to the first time she had ever felt this kind of exclusion in a space she had worked so hard to enter. It had been years ago, during her doctoral program. She remembered walking into a seminar room, eager, prepared, her research slides tucked carefully into her folder. One of her professors, a man she had admired for his brilliance, had glanced at her and then asked, "Are you here to take notes for one of the presenters?" She had been too shocked to respond at first. Then she had stood straighter, introduced herself, and proceeded to deliver a presentation that left the room silent with its precision. Still, the sting of that assumption had stayed with her. It was the same stink she felt now, subtle but sharp, reminding her that no matter how high she climbed, there were always those ready to question her presence. The clinking of cutlery from the galley signaled the approach of meal service. Daniel returned, moving gracefully down the aisle, his smile steady and kind. He stopped at Maya's seat, holding a menu. "We'll be taking dinner orders soon," he said. "Did you have a chance to look at the menu earlier?" "Yes," Maya said, grateful for the genuine tone in his voice. "The salmon sounded wonderful." "Excellent choice," Daniel replied, jotting it down with a nod. "I'll confirm when we begin service." When Karen arrived minutes later with her notepad, the difference in tone was striking. She leaned warmly toward Mr. Harper, laughing at his joke about preferring prime rib as rare as his patience. She lingered with Ms. Davenport, complimenting her again on her jewelry before accepting her order for the salmon. Then she turned to Maya. The smile faded. The warmth drained. The pen hovered above the notepad. "And for you," Karen asked. Her voice clipped. "The citrus glazed salmon, Please, Maya said, her voice clear. Karen paused, her eyes flicking up for the first time to meet Maya's. There was no warmth there, only a flat, dismissive stare. I'm afraid we're out of the salmon, she said, her tone carrying a finality that felt rehearsed. Maya blinked, surprised. Oh, she said evenly. In that case, the prime rib, medium rare. Karen shook her head slightly, her lips tightening. Those are all spoken for as well. The only option remaining is the mushroom risotto. A flicker of confusion crossed Maya's face. It was unusual for 2 of the 3 entrees to be gone so early, especially for someone seated in the second row of first class. Airlines overstocked meals in premium cabins precisely to avoid such disappointments. It wasn't just improbable, it was nearly impossible. Really, Maya said, her voice calm, measured. You're out of both salmon and prime rib. They've been very popular tonight, Karen replied, her tone cooling further, as though Maya's question itself were an imposition. Before Maya could respond, Daniel passed across the aisle to Mrs. Davenport. Maya heard the woman's voice clearly. The salmon sounds divine. I'll have that. Daniel nodded, writing it down without hesitation. Of course, Mrs. Davenport. Maya felt the knot form in her stomach, cold and heavy. This was no longer subtle. This was deliberate. She turned back to Karen, her gaze steady. The passenger in 2D just ordered the salmon, she said, her tone even. Karen didn't flinch. Instead, her expression hardened. She had a pre-order, she said flatly. It was reserved for her. Maya recognized the lie instantly. She knew how the system worked. Pre-orders were flagged in the manifest and processed differently. The attendant would have acknowledged it at the start of service, not taken it down as if it were a regular order. She considered her words carefully. She could feel the eyes of the cabin turning toward her, curiosity pricking at the silence. She could sense Mr. Harper in 1A shifting in his seat, pretending to look out the window but clearly listening. She could feel Mrs. Davenport's gaze lingering with something like smug satisfaction. Inside, Maya's thoughts raced. Should she push back here, expose the lie for what it was, or should she let it go? Allow the sting to fade, keep her dignity in silence. She thought of all the times she had been told not to make trouble, not to push too hard, not to risk being labeled difficult. The words hovered at the edge of her lips. She swallowed them down, forcing herself to breathe. She wouldn't let anger dictate her next move. She wouldn't give Karen the satisfaction of seeing her lose composure. Instead, she spoke with calm precision. I see, she said quietly. In that case, I'll pass on dinner. Karen's pen stilled, and for the first time a flicker of irritation crossed her face. She wanted Maya to accept the risotto, to accept the choice she had been given. Maya's refusal was not defiance in volume, but in silence. Very well, Karen said sharply, scribbling something onto her pad before moving on. Maya picked up her book again, her hands steady, though the words blurred once more. The humiliation sat heavy in her chest. She could smell the salmon wafting from the galley, soon to be plated for someone else, someone whose presence was never questioned. The meal service moved forward around her, but for Maya, the cabin had shifted. The warm cocoon of first class had fractured, revealing the fault lines beneath. This wasn't about food. It never had been. It was about belonging, about who was granted dignity and who was denied it. She closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself. She would not give them her anger, but she would not forget this moment either. The storm had begun. The scent of roasted garlic and buttered bread floated through the cabin as dinner service officially began. Trays clinked softly. Silverware chimed against porcelain, and the hushed luxury of first class transformed into a stage for quiet indulgence. Plates of prime rib gleamed under warm cabin lights. Salmon fillets shimmered with citrus glaze, and the risotto, creamy with truffles, carried a heady aroma that wafted from the galley. Maya sat upright, hands folded lightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the magazine in front of her, though she wasn't truly reading. Every sound seemed magnified. The scrape of a knife, the pouring of wine, the hum of polite conversation. She heard the soft laugh of Mrs. Davenport as Daniel placed a perfectly cooked salmon fillet in front of her. The fragrance rose immediately, filling the space between them like a quiet mockery. Maya's stomach tightened. She wasn't angry at the food itself, but at the blunt lie that had been wrapped around its delivery. Her eyes flickered toward Daniel, who glanced quickly in her direction. For the briefest moment their gazes met. His carried something unspoken, an apology, a recognition, but he was bound by hierarchy, tethered by the authority of the purser and the lead attendant. His silence wasn't complicity. It was survival. Maya gave him the faintest nod, a silent message of understanding. Karen moved through the aisle with her head held high, her smile wide again as she served Mr. Harper his plate of prime rib, steaming and fragrant. He chuckled, making some offhand comment about how he hadn't eaten this well since his last board retreat. Karen laughed with him, patting his shoulder lightly before gliding away. When she reached Maya's seat, she didn't pause. She placed a small bowl of salad on the tray table, her movements clipped and deliberate. The lettuce leaves glistened under the cabin lights, a side dish masquerading as a meal. She didn't ask if Maya wanted it. She didn't offer dessert or an alternative. She simply set it down as though the matter had been settled. "Enjoy," Karen said curtly, her eyes already shifting past Maya. Maya looked down at the salad. The humiliation rose again, hot and sharp, though her face remained serene. She took a slow breath, lifting her gaze to meet Karen's retreating back. For a moment, she thought about letting it go, about swallowing the slight and finishing the flight in silence. She could sleep, arrive in Paris, and leave this behind, like all the other small indignities she had carried quietly over the years. But something in her resisted. Perhaps it was the blatantness of the lie, the audacity of being dismissed so openly in a space she had paid dearly to occupy. Perhaps it was the way Karen's words for you had hung in the air, heavy with exclusion. Or perhaps it was the knowledge that silence, though easier in the moment, would only feed the pattern. She placed her hands gently on the tray table and pushed the salad aside. Then she pressed the call button. The soft chime cut through the cabin. Heads turned. Karen appeared almost immediately, her expression strained, as though she had anticipated this moment. "Yes, ma'am," she said, her tone tight. Maya kept her voice calm, precise. "I'd like some clarification. When I asked for the salmon, I was told it was unavailable. When I asked for the prime rib, I was told the same. Yet the passengers seated near me were served both. Could you please explain how that is possible?" Karen's eyes flickered briefly, but her posture remained rigid. "As I mentioned earlier, those entrees were spoken for. After I ordered them," Maya asked, her tone soft but pointed. "I am aware of how the system works. Orders are fulfilled beginning with the first row. I ordered before Mrs. Davenport, yet she received the salmon. I'd like to understand how that decision was made." A faint pink flush crept up Karen's neck. Her mask of professionalism wavered. She leaned slightly closer, her voice dropping just enough that only Maya could hear. "We don't have to show passengers our manifest. The salmon is not available for you. You can have the risotto or the salad. That's your choice." The words hung in the air like a slap. "Not available for you." Maya felt the silence swell around her. She was aware of eyes turning again, of Mr. Harper shifting uncomfortably, of Mrs. Davenport smirking faintly behind her wineglass. She was aware of Daniel, frozen near the galley, his expression taut with unease. Her heart beat steadily, though her hands remained perfectly still. She thought of every time she had been told to let it go, to avoid confrontation. She thought of the young women who worked in her company, who looked to her as an example. She thought of her mother's voice reminding her, again and again, that dignity is not given, it is defended. She spoke softly, her voice carrying more weight than a shout ever could. "Very well. I've lost my appetite." Karen's jaw tightened. For a moment she seemed ready to argue, to press further, but instead she straightened abruptly, turned on her heel, and walked away. The cabin remained silent, thick with tension. Maya picked up her book again. Though she didn't turn the page, she let the moment sit, let the weight of it press down on the air. She wouldn't eat the risotto. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of choosing between scraps. Minutes passed before the rhythm of service resumed. The sound of forks scraping plates, of glasses clinking against one another, filled the void. The aroma of prime rib and salmon swirled together in the cabin, a fragrant reminder of the slight. Maya kept her eyes fixed on the page, though she absorbed nothing. Her mind replayed Karen's words, each syllable etched into her memory. When Daniel returned later to clear empty plates, he paused by her seat. His voice dropped low, his eyes carrying genuine regret. "Dr. Ellington," he said quietly, "can I get you anything at all? A cheese plate, dessert, something." Maya met his gaze, and for the first time that evening, her expression softened. "Thank you, Daniel. That's kind of you. But what I'd like is to speak to the purser." Daniel's eyes widened slightly, but he nodded without hesitation. "Of course. I'll get him right away." He disappeared into the galley, and moments later returned with a man in his early 50s. The purser, Charles Grant, wore the weary confidence of someone who had managed countless flights. His smile was smooth, practiced, the kind that had been used to placate 1,000 passenger complaints. But there was something rehearsed about it, a polish that didn't quite conceal the sharpness underneath. "Dr. Ellington," he began, his tone calm and diplomatic. "I understand there's been some confusion regarding your meal choice." "There was no confusion," Maya said, her voice level. "I was told both the salmon and the prime rib were unavailable. Yet I watched as passengers who ordered after me received them. Your attendant then told me those meals were reserved. Though I know the process and can assure you that isn't true. This wasn't confusion. This was a denial of service." Charles's smile faltered. Just briefly, he glanced over his shoulder where Karen stood with her arms crossed, her chin tilted upward in defiance. She leaned in and whispered something into his ear. His expression shifted almost immediately, from placating to defensive. "Karen informs me," he said, "that you became aggressive when she was simply trying to explain a stocking issue. We did have a last-minute catering error at LAX. The manifests weren't updated correctly. She was doing her best under the circumstances. Sometimes passengers misinterpret tone when our staff is under pressure." Maya's brows lifted slightly. It was almost impressive, the swiftness with which the narrative had been twisted. She had been painted as the aggressor, her calm precision reframed as hostility. "I was not aggressive," she said, her enunciation sharp, deliberate. "I was clear, and the catering error is a new explanation. A moment ago, it was a pre-order. The story seems to change, depending on the moment." Charles's smile thinned, his patience wearing. "The meal service is over. Dr. Ellington, I suggest we move forward and allow you to enjoy the rest of your flight." Her jaw tightened. He wasn't just dismissing her complaint. He was warning her. The wall had been built, brick by brick. Karen's lie, Charles's defense, the suggestion of her aggression. It was more than bias now. It was gaslighting. It was intimidation. Maya sat back slowly, her hands folding neatly in her lap. She had made her case. They had made their wall. The question now was not whether she would fight, but how. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was preparation. The hum of the aircraft carried on, indifferent to the storm brewing in the first-class cabin. Plates clattered softly as they were cleared, glasses of wine refilled, and yet around Maya's seat there lingered a tension that refused to dissolve. The denial of dinner had transformed from a small slight into a public wound. Maya remained composed, but beneath her calm exterior, her mind pulsed with precision. She had spoken plainly. She had laid out the facts. And yet the response had been lies stacked on lies, each one delivered with a veneer of authority. Karen stood tall in her corner, her arms crossed, eyes flashing with quiet triumph. Charles loomed beside her, his polished authority now sharpened into a weapon of dismissal. "I want this documented," Maya said evenly, her voice low but carrying. "I want my complaint entered as an official record of discriminatory service." Charles's eyes narrowed, though his smile did not falter. "Dr. Ellington, I assure you, all service issues are noted appropriately in the flight report. We will include your feedback." Maya tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. Feedback is what one leaves about a lukewarm entree or a delayed beverage. What occurred here was not poor service. It was deliberate. It was discriminatory. And I want the record to reflect that. Karen shifted uncomfortably, her composure beginning to crack. A faint red climbed her cheeks, though her lips curled into something close to a smirk. Charles cleared his throat, his tone edging toward warning. "Our crew has the authority to make judgment calls under pressure," he said. "From what I understand, Karen followed procedure as best as possible, given the catering limitations. Sometimes passengers take offense where none was intended." Maya exhaled slowly. There it was again, the neat reframing of bias as a misunderstanding, of prejudice as procedure, of insult as accident. She had seen this tactic before, in boardrooms where her competence was questioned, in interviews where her success was attributed to luck rather than skill. She knew the shape of this dance, and she knew how dangerous it was to let the narrative take root. Her voice sharpened slightly, still quiet but laced with steel. "There is nothing procedural about telling me that entrees are unavailable and then serving them to others who ordered after me. That is not a mistake. That is not a limitation. That is a choice made by your lead flight attendant, supported now by you." Charles's practiced smile faltered again, and for the briefest second, the mask slipped. There was irritation there, not the irritation of a man defending truth, but of one defending control. "Dr. Ellington," he said, his voice lower now, more forceful. "We need to keep perspective. This is, after all, about a meal. I suggest we not escalate this further. The captain is occupied with flying the aircraft, and we would not disturb him over something as minor as dinner service. Maya's jaw tightened. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes cutting into his. This is not about dinner. Do not reduce my dignity to a plate of food. This is about being told I do not belong, about being lied to, about being gaslighted in front of an entire cabin. And if you believe that is minor, then your perspective is exactly what perpetuates this. Silence followed. Mr. Harper in 1A shifted uncomfortably, pretending to study the in-flight map on his screen. Mrs. Davenport sipped her wine slowly, her eyes glinting with the satisfaction of a spectator at a performance. Daniel lingered near the galley, his posture tense, as if willing himself invisible while still silently bearing witness. Karen broke the silence with a sharp exhale. We've done everything by the book, she said, her tone brittle, defensive. It's not our responsibility if passengers interpret things however they wish. The words dripped with disdain. Maya stared at her, calm, collected. Interpretation? She repeated softly. Mrs. Davenport received salmon moments after I was told it was unavailable. Mr. Harper received prime rib after I was told those were spoken for. There is no interpretation required. It is observable fact. Charles stepped in again, his tone now taking on the dangerous edge of authority. Dr. Ellington, let me be very clear. We will note your concerns in the flight record, but continued disruption to service could result in further action upon landing. I trust you understand. There it was, the threat, the quiet but unmistakable message. Accept your place, accept our narrative, or suffer consequences. Maya felt the heat of humiliation spread through her chest, but she steadied herself, pressing her palms flat against her lap. She thought of the younger women in her company, of every mentee she had ever encouraged to speak truth, even in the face of power. Her mind flashed with memories. The investor who once told her that her company was admirable for a side project before she proved him wrong. The professor who doubted her thesis until it was published in a leading journal. The countless times she had been underestimated, dismissed, reduced to something smaller than she was. And each time, she had answered not with rage, but with clarity. She could feel her pulse in her throat, a steady drumbeat. She could raise her voice now. She could unleash the anger that burned beneath her calm, but she knew how quickly that would be used against her. She could already imagine the words disruptive, aggressive, uncooperative, words that would stain her name in a report, words that would ripple into how she was perceived by those who never witnessed the truth. No, she would not give them that. She would not hand them the weapon to wound her further. Instead, she leaned back slowly in her seat, her eyes never leaving Charles's. Her voice came soft, controlled, almost quiet enough to be missed, but carrying the weight of iron. I understand perfectly, she said. Thank you for clarifying where you stand. Charles's expression flickered, uncertain whether he had won or lost. He gave a short nod, then turned back toward the galley with Karen in tow. Together they walked away, their backs straight, their postures stiff with the satisfaction of people who believed they had reasserted control. Around Maya, the cabin slowly resumed its rhythm. Glasses clinked again. Forks scraped plates. Laughter bubbled faintly from Mrs. Davenport's corner. Yet the atmosphere was no longer the same. Something had cracked open. Every passenger in that small, enclosed world had seen the fracture. They had witnessed not just a service dispute, but the quiet stripping of dignity. And whether they admitted it or not, they felt its weight. Maya sat in silence, her hands folded, her eyes fixed on the dark screen in front of her. She had spoken. She had been dismissed. She had been threatened. The wall was complete now, fortified by lies, arrogance, and authority. But what Charles and Karen did not know was that Maya had never lost a war fought in silence. Her silence now was not surrender. It was calculation. The salad remained untouched on the tray beside her, the limp lettuce wilting under the cabin's controlled air. The scent of salmon and rosemary wafted stronger from across the aisle. But Maya did not let her gaze wander. She closed her eyes briefly, breathing deeply, letting the humiliation settle into something colder, denser, not rage, resolve. They had written their story. Soon, she would write hers. The cabin lights had dimmed into the soft hues of evening, a simulation of twilight designed to lull travelers into sleep as the plane cut silently through the sky. Most passengers had settled into their meals, their conversations hushed, their gestures slower with the weight of wine and fatigue. To anyone passing by, it looked serene, the quiet luxury of transatlantic travel in full effect. But inside Maya Ellington's seat, serenity was an illusion. Beneath her calm exterior, her mind churned like a storm just beyond the horizon. She had spoken the truth. She had been dismissed, lied to, threatened. And now she sat in silence, her dignity intact, yet her spirit vibrating with the strain of keeping her composure. She stared at the dark screen in front of her, its reflection showing only the faint outline of her own face. She thought about how many times she had been here before, not on an airplane, but in this place of choice, this intersection between silence and resistance. Her thoughts drifted back years, to a seminar hall during her doctoral studies. She had stood at the podium, her research meticulously prepared, her slides sharp and precise, and then, just before she began, she had heard the whispered comment from the back of the room. "Does she even belong here?" The words had pierced her concentration, but she had delivered anyway, each sentence sharper than the last. By the end, the whisperer had been silent, but the echo of his doubt had remained with her. She remembered another moment, earlier still, when she was 14, a science fair in her hometown gymnasium. Her project, a homemade water filtration system, had been judged by a panel of men in neatly pressed suits. They had looked at her work with a patronizing smile, one of them remarking, "Ambitious, isn't it? For someone so young." Yet when the results were announced, her project had taken first place, and the same man had shaken her hand with a forced smile. She had learned then that brilliance alone was not enough. One had to be unshakable. On this flight, the challenge felt sharper, because it wasn't about proving her intellect. It was about proving her right to exist in a space she had already paid for, earned, and deserved. The denial of a meal was trivial on the surface, but beneath it was the deeper message that her presence was negotiable, and that she could not accept. She closed her eyes, leaning her head against the seat. A voice in her mind whispered what she had heard too many times. "Don't make it worse. Don't be the angry black woman. Keep your head down. Get through the flight." She knew that narrative well, the one that demanded silence as the price of peace. But another voice rose within her, stronger, steadier. "And what has silence ever given you? Did silence win you the grant for your research? Did silence secure the contracts that made your company thrive? Did silence stop them from questioning if you belonged in the boardroom? Silence had protected no one but those who had sought to diminish her." Her fingers tapped lightly against her armrest, a slow rhythm that matched her pulse. She breathed deeply, her chest rising and falling with control. She would not shout. She would not lose herself in anger. But neither would she allow this to pass unnoticed. From the corner of her eye, she caught Daniel watching her again. His gaze carried concern, though he looked away quickly when Karen swept past him. Even his kindness reminded her of the stakes. There were always those who saw, who knew the truth, but who lacked the power to intervene. How many Daniels had she known in her life? People who witnessed injustice but stayed silent out of fear. People who bore the weight of knowing but did not act. She would not be one of them. Her thoughts shifted to her company. Nutrivita Systems. It had taken her years to build it, brick by brick, contract by contract. The patents were hers. The innovations were hers. And every airline that served gourmet meals on long-haul flights, including this one, relied on her technology. Without it, their promise of luxury at 30,000 feet collapsed into mediocrity. They depended on her, though they didn't even realize it in this moment. That thought settled in her like a stone, heavy but grounding. Power was not always loud. Sometimes it was quiet, unseen, waiting until the exact moment it needed to be revealed. They believed she was powerless in seat 2A. They believed they could deny her without consequence. But she knew better. Her mind flickered with possibilities, a complaint to customer service pointless. It would vanish into corporate bureaucracy, written off as exaggeration, a confrontation with Karen. Already done, already twisted against her, a demand to see the captain denied. No, the only action left was the one only she could take, one that would ripple far beyond this cabin. Still, she hesitated. She wasn't reckless. Every decision had consequences, and she weighed them carefully, as she always did. Would action here make her look vindictive? Would people accuse her of overreacting? Was it worth igniting a storm over a single dinner service? She pressed her lips together, closing her eyes again. Then she imagined a future flight, a young woman who looked like her sitting in a similar seat, facing a similar slight. Would silence now protect that woman, or would it guarantee that the cycle continued? No, silence was not an option. Maya opened her eyes, the calmness in her expression belying the fire in her chest. She reached for the glass of water on her tray and took a measured sip, as though nothing had changed. Around her, passengers continued eating, laughing softly, sipping their wine. Karen passed again, her smile wide for Mr. Harper, brittle for everyone else. Charles remained near the galley, his posture firm, his authority radiating through the aisle. They thought the matter was over. They thought they had silenced her. They had no idea the decision forming inside her. Maya lowered her glass and placed it gently back on the tray. Her fingers lingered for a moment, steady, deliberate. Then she picked up her phone from the side pocket of her seat. The satellite Wi-Fi symbol glowed faintly in the corner of the screen. It wasn't fast, it wasn't cheap, but it was all she needed. Her hands were calm as she unlocked the device. Her fingers moved across the screen with the precision of a surgeon. She wasn't writing out of anger. She was writing with the clarity of someone who had measured the variables, run the calculations, and decided on the most effective response. She drafted a message to her COO, Jordan Lee, short, precise, irreversible, the kind of command that could shift an industry overnight. Her thumb hovered over the send button. For a brief moment, she hesitated. She thought of the fallout, the chaos, the countless employees of Aerodyne Global who had nothing to do with this moment, but who would feel its impact. She thought of the boardrooms that would shake, the stock prices that would tumble, the passengers tomorrow who would not be served as promised. Her chest rose with another deep breath. Then she remembered Karen's words. Not available for you. Her thumb pressed down. The message vanished into the ether, arcing toward the satellite, racing across oceans to a secure server. Maya set the phone face down on the tray. She leaned back in her seat, her expression serene. To anyone watching, she looked like a passenger readying herself for sleep. But inside, the storm had been unleashed. The plane glided steadily over the Atlantic, its engines thrumming with the kind of mechanical certainty that passengers trusted without question. Inside the hushed first-class cabin, Maya Ellington leaned back in her seat, her phone resting face down on the tray beside her glass of water. To anyone watching, she looked tranquil, as though she had finally surrendered to the rhythm of the flight. But beneath the polished calm, something irreversible had been set in motion. One small message, a handful of words typed with deliberate precision, was now racing across encrypted servers, activating protocols known only to a few. Maya closed her eyes, not in sleep, but in thought. She pictured Jordan Lee, her COO, sitting in their Boston office. She could see him glancing at the alert, his face tightening as he read the words. She could imagine him pulling up the necessary documents, signing the suspension order, and transmitting it to Aerodyne Global's executive team. It would be night in Boston, but Jordan was always awake, always ready. He had been her partner since the earliest days of Nutrivita Systems, and he knew exactly what to do. In her mind, the dominoes began to fall. The supply chains Aerodyne had built were intricate, vast, dependent on her patented preservation technology. At midnight GMT, the handshake key that validated their use of Nutrivita's NutriSeal system would expire. Without renewal, every oven, every storage pod, every transport container would fail. Food that was meant to last 72 hours would degrade in less than 12. Premium meals prepared for first-class cabins across 4 continents would spoil in minutes. Maya opened her eyes again. The cabin was unchanged. Daniel moved quietly through the aisle, collecting dishes with his steady smile, though his eyes flickered toward her with concern. Karen swept past, her spine stiff, her chin high, the satisfaction of her earlier victory still etched into her expression. Charles remained by the galley, his posture rigid, his authority radiating outward like a shield. None of them knew what had just been set in motion. None of them understood that the woman they had dismissed as powerless held the threads of their industry in her hands. She reached for her book again, flipping to a random page. She didn't read. The words blurred. Instead, she thought of her mother, who used to tell her, "The world won't always recognize your worth. Maya, sometimes it will try to erase it. But your power isn't in their recognition. It's in your refusal to be diminished." Far below, in a kitchen at JFK Airport, an Aerodyne Global technician frowned at his screen. A transport pod had just flashed an error message, "License invalid." He tried again, resealing the lid. The pod refused. The chilled salmon fillers inside sat exposed to the air. The technician muttered under his breath, resetting the system. The error persisted. At Frankfurt, a galley oven on a transatlantic inbound flight blinked red. The pilot's report was terse. Oven 2 not responding. Display reads license. Invalid. The flight attendants scrambled to find alternatives, serving cold bread and cheese to passengers who had paid thousands for their seats. Confusion rippled through the crew. In Singapore, Dozens of kitchen staff stared in disbelief as the entire line of storage pods failed at once. Lids popped open with soft beeps, the food inside suddenly unprotected. Phone calls lit up within minutes, frantic voices demanding explanations. In New York, Aerodyne's CEO, Richard Halden, was asleep in his penthouse overlooking the Hudson River. His phone buzzed once, then again, then relentlessly until he finally stirred. He reached for it groggily, squinting at the screen. Severity Alpha License Suspension. His heart lurched. He sat bolt upright, the fog of sleep evaporating instantly. He opened the message. Nutravita Systems had suspended Aerodyne's license for use of the NutraSeal technology, effective immediately. The grounds breach of contract, discriminatory conduct by client personnel. Richard's throat went dry. He dialed his general counsel with shaking hands. "What the hell is going on?" he barked when the man answered. "We got the notice half an hour ago," came the reply. "It's real. Dr. Ellington signed it herself. There's nothing we can do. The system will lock out globally at midnight. Find her," Richard snapped. "Where is she?" "She's on a Global Skies flight, LA to Paris. She's unreachable," Richard cursed, pacing his room in his silk pajamas. He could feel the blood draining from his face. Without Nutravita's technology, Aerodyne was nothing, a glorified caterer, vulnerable, replaceable. The market would smell blood the moment the news leaked. He glanced at the after-hours stock ticker on his phone. It had already begun. Aerodyne was down 10% in pre-market trading. "Get me Jordan Lee," Richard said. "We've tried. He's not taking calls. Then get me Ellington. She won't respond." Richard sank into his leather chair, his mind racing. One woman, one passenger on one flight had just pulled the pin from a grenade that would detonate his empire. He thought of his shareholders, of the airlines already calling, of the board that would demand his head by morning. He closed his eyes, exhaling shakily. This couldn't be happening. Not like this. Back on the plane. Maya sat serenely, sipping her water. The salad Karen had dumped on her tray remained untouched, the lettuce wilting. Around her, passengers continued with their meals, unaware that the world beneath them was shifting. "Mr. Harper scrolled through his emails on his tablet, oblivious. "Mrs. Davenport leaned back with her wineglass, savoring her salmon with smug delight. Maya watched her quietly, not with envy, not with bitterness, but with the clarity of someone who saw the entire system laid bare. Mrs. Davenport ate her salmon because she fit the mold of belonging. Maya had been denied because she did not. That was the entire equation. And equations, Maya knew, could be rewritten. Daniel approached again, collecting glasses. He paused at her seat, lowering his voice. "Dr. Ellington," he said softly, "are you sure you don't want anything? Dessert, maybe just something small." Maya looked at him, her eyes gentle. "Thank you, Daniel," she said quietly. "But no, I'm fine." She wasn't fine. Of course, the sting was still there, sharp as ever, but she wouldn't let them see her hunger, her need. She had already fed something far more important justice in its most uncompromising form. The cabin darkened further. The lights dimmed to mimic night. Passengers reclined their seats, settling in for the long crossing. Maya adjusted her blanket, closing her eyes at last. Her breathing slowed, even calm. The storm outside her body raged elsewhere now, in kitchens, in boardrooms, in frantic midnight phone calls. Karen walked past once more, glancing at Maya with that same condescending look. as though she had won, as though the silent passenger in 2A had been subdued. Maya opened her eyes briefly, meeting her gaze with unreadable calm. Karen saw nothing. She had no idea that the woman she had tried to diminish had just sent shockwaves through an entire industry. She didn't know that by morning. Her employer would be in free fall. She didn't realize that the words not available for you would echo back as the most expensive mistake of her career. Maya closed her eyes again. The engines hummed. The cabin slept. The world below convulsed. And in seat 2A, the architect of it all rested, serene and unshaken. At 37,000 feet, the cabin remained a bubble of artificial calm. The lights were dimmed to a dusky glow. The engines droned with hypnotic steadiness, and most of the passengers around Maya had reclined their seats into cocoons of comfort. To the casual eye, it was an uneventful night flight crossing the Atlantic. But beyond the plane, invisible to those sleeping within it, an empire was cracking apart. In Aerodyne's London operations hub, alarms were already sounding. A line of error messages scrolled endlessly across monitors in the control room. Red notifications blinked on screen after screen, ovens failing to initiate, pods refusing to seal, refrigeration units flashing invalid license. Engineers and supervisors huddled together, their voices rising in disbelief. "This can't be right," one muttered, running a hand through his hair. "We tested the handshake keys yesterday. Run the override." Another said, tapping furiously at a keyboard, "I already did. It won't accept it." The phones on the supervisor's desk rang incessantly, each call more frantic than the last. Airline partners demanding explanations, crews stranded mid-service, chefs furious that hours of preparation had spoiled in minutes. The entire backbone of Aerodyne's premium service was disintegrating before their eyes. At JFK, the chaos was no less. Rows of storage pods popped open in the chilled kitchens, their contents exposed. Delicate entrees rendered useless. Salmon fillets dulled under fluorescent lights. Beef cooled into inedible slabs. Vegetables wilted into limp heaps. Staff shouted orders, scrambling for alternatives that didn't exist. One manager slammed his clipboard onto a counter, his voice hoarse. "Call the airlines. Tell them we can't board the premium meals. Snacks only. Get something, anything, into those galleys before boarding. But the clients paid for. I don't care what they paid for. Do it." Meanwhile, Frankfurt's control center buzzed with equal desperation. Lufthansa's catering liaison demanded answers, her voice sharp with anger. "We have 6 aircraft in the air right now, all reporting failures. First-class passengers are being told there is no dinner service. Do you understand what that means for our brand?" The Aerodyne manager could barely breathe. He tried to explain, tried to buy time, but every word felt like a stone in his mouth. In Singapore, the scene was apocalyptic. Entire airport kitchens, stocked for long-haul flights across Asia, were inoperable. Frantic workers watched helplessly as meals spoiled in front of them. Tens of thousands of dollars in ingredients wasted. Hours of preparation destroyed. The heat of panic filled the room as executives barked orders that could not be followed. By midnight GMT, the collapse was total. Hundreds of aircraft carried passengers expecting fine dining and were instead offered cold rolls and fruit cups. Crew members apologized through gritted teeth, knowing their words rang hollow. The ripple effect spread instantly onto social media. Passengers posted photos of empty trays, of crew explaining oven errors, of business-class cabins reduced to snack baskets. The outrage was immediate. Hashtags trended across platforms. Angry travelers tagging Aerodyne and its airline clients with furious demands. In New York, Aerodyne's CEO, Richard Halden, was pacing the length of his penthouse office, still in his nightclothes. His phone pressed tight against his ear, his voice raw from shouting. "Tell me what we can do," he demanded of his general counsel. "There's nothing. The license is revoked until Nutravita reinstates it. Without their technology, nothing works. Then call Jordan Lee again. Call Ellington. They won't take our calls. She's on a flight. She won't even see a message until she lands." Richard's stomach twisted. The market opened in less than 8 hours. By then, the news would be everywhere. Investors would smell the weakness. Shareholders would revolt. Aerodyne wasn't just facing a bad quarter. They were facing obliteration. He slammed the phone onto his desk and stood before the window, staring at the Hudson River. His reflection stared back, pale, frantic, unrecognizable. For years, he had ruled this industry like a monarch, untouchable. Now, a single passenger on a single flight had set fire to his kingdom. Back on Flight 482, Maya adjusted her blanket, settling deeper into her seat. She wasn't asleep, though her posture suggested she could be. Her eyes remained closed, her breathing slow, but her mind was alive. She imagined the ripple effect, the frantic phone calls, the panicked meetings. She knew exactly how the system would collapse. She had designed it. Her hand brushed lightly against her phone on the tray, as though reassuring herself it was still there. She had acted not out of spite, but out of principle, and principle carried consequences. She thought again of the risk, of the collateral damage innocent employees scrambling in kitchens, airline staff caught unprepared, passengers disappointed. But then she remembered the humiliation in Karen's eyes, the smugness in Charles's tone, the smirk of Mrs. Davenport as she enjoyed her salmon. And she remembered the deeper truth if unchecked. Bias became culture. If ignored, injustice became standard. Maya opened her eyes, gazing into the dim glow of the cabin. Karen passed once more, her chin lifted, her eyes sweeping briefly across Maya's seat with a look that was both wary and self-satisfied. She still believed she had won, that she had reduced Maya to silence. Maya allowed herself the faintest smile. Let her believe that for now. By morning, the truth would be undeniable. In London, at Global Sky's headquarters, the airline's executives were already in emergency session. Reports had come in from flights across Europe, ovens failing, meals undeliverable, premium passengers irate. The head of customer service spoke urgently. "This isn't a glitch. It's systemic. Every Aerodyne-equipped flight is affected. We're facing refunds, compensation claims, public outrage." The CEO pressed his hands against the table, his face pale. "Call Aerodyne. Get an explanation." "They're not answering," someone replied. "Then find out who's behind this." One young analyst spoke up hesitantly. "The suspension notice references a breach of Nutravita's brand integrity clause, signed by Dr. Maya Ellington." The room fell silent. The CEO straightened slowly. He knew the name. Everyone in the industry knew the name. "She was on one of our flights tonight," the analyst added. "LAX to Paris, first class, seat 2A. The CEO's stomach dropped. One woman, one incident, and now the airline itself was entangled in catastrophe. By dawn, media outlets would swarm the story, the image of privilege disrupted, of premium service failing, of airlines scrambling to placate furious passengers. It was irresistible. Aerodyne's carefully cultivated reputation as the titan of airborne luxury was evaporating in real time. On the plane, the night stretched on. Passengers dozed, unaware of the storm unraveling below them. Maya sat upright again, staring at the window. The dark expanse of the Atlantic stretched endlessly, dotted with faint stars above. She felt a calmness wash over her. Not triumph, not revenge, but something steadier. Resolve. She had been told she didn't belong. She had been denied dignity in the simplest of ways. And in response, she had shown them what true power looked like. Not in shouting, not in pleading, but in shifting the ground beneath their feet until they realized they stood on nothing at all. The engines hummed on. The cabin slept. And far below, a billion-dollar empire trembled in the dark. The clock on Richard Halden's nightstand read 2:45 me. When he finally gave up on pacing, his penthouse, usually a sanctuary of sleek modernity and calm views of the Hudson River, felt like a gilded cage closing in around him. The phone in his hand vibrated constantly, each new notification a hammer strike against what little composure he still held. His CFO had called twice, his general counsel nearly a dozen times. Airline CEOs were demanding explanations he could not give. Investors were sending frantic messages, and the Aerodyne board of directors was already assembling an emergency call. His empire, the empire he had cultivated for decades, was unraveling in a single night. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city glittering below him, uncaring of his panic. His reflection stared back at him disheveled, gray at the temples, silk pajama shirt wrinkled. He looked less like a titan of industry and more like a man staring down his own extinction. "Find her," he snapped into the phone, his voice hoarse. "I don't care how. Track her flight manifest, her hotel reservation, whatever it takes. I need to speak to Ellington before the market opens." "Sir," his assistant replied cautiously, "she's on Global Skies Flight 482, first class. The suspension notice specifically cites that flight. It's personal." Richard closed his eyes. Personal. The word made his stomach churn. This wasn't just a legal action. It was retribution. He gritted his teeth. No, not retribution. Justice. That was worse. Justice carried moral weight, and moral weight could topple even billion-dollar structures. "Book me a jet," he said finally. "I want to be in London before she steps foot out of her hotel." His assistant hesitated. "Sir, that's less than 7 hours." "Do it," Richard barked, the desperation cracking his voice. Within the hour. He was in a chauffeured car, racing toward Teterboro Airport. The city sped past in blurred lights, indifferent to the crisis in his chest. The private jet waited, fueled and ready, a hollow luxury when compared to the storm awaiting him in Europe. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the chaos only deepened. At Heathrow, Aerodyne's UK operations were drowning. Airline executives had convened an emergency meeting in a sterile boardroom, their voices raised in panic and fury. Reports streamed and first-class passengers served nothing but crackers and fruit. Social media outrage climbing into the millions of impressions, journalists circling like sharks. "This is catastrophic," one executive said, his fists clenched on the table. "We've built our premium image around Aerodyne, and now, overnight, it's collapsing. Do you understand what our passengers are saying? That we've betrayed them, that we've lied to them." Another voice cut in. "Aerodyne isn't answering. They're hiding. The only person who can fix this is Ellington." The room fell silent at her name. Everyone knew it. Everyone in the industry owed some fraction of their luxury to her. She wasn't just another supplier. She was the architect of airborne dining as it existed today. "She's arriving this morning," the analyst added quietly. "Paris, Flight 482, Seat 2A. Back in the cabin of Flight 482, Maya Ellington opened her eyes to the dim glow of the overhead lights. The long night was nearly over. Outside her window, a faint line of dawn painted the horizon, pale and delicate against the endless black of the Atlantic sky. The engines hummed with steady certainty, oblivious to the turmoil unfolding thousands of miles below. Around her, passengers began to stir. "Mr. Harper stretched in his seat, rubbing his eyes before reaching for his tablet again. "Mrs. Davenport adjusted her silk scarf and ordered another glass of sparkling water with the smug entitlement of someone untouched by the undercurrents of the night. Karen moved briskly through the cabin, her voice bright and rehearsed, as if the confrontation hours earlier had never occurred. She offered warm croissants and fresh fruit, the breakfast service crisp and efficient. But when her eyes slid toward Maya's seat, her steps faltered just slightly, her smile tightening before she moved on. Charles, too, avoided her gaze, his authority now tinged with unease, though his face remained fixed in neutrality. Daniel approached quietly, a tray of pastries in his hands. He bent toward Maya's seat with a soft, almost conspiratorial tone. "Would you like something for breakfast, Dr. Ellington?" Maya looked at him, her expression gentle. "No, thank you," she said. "I'm fine." She wasn't fine, not in the conventional sense. Her stomach was empty, but her spirit was steady. She had no appetite for their offerings. What nourished her now was resolve, the certainty that she had answered insult not with silence, not with rage, but with precision. The announcement came over the intercom: descent into Paris. Seatbacks upright, trays stowed, belts fastened. The ritual of arrival unfolded, mechanical and routine. But for Maya, this was no ordinary landing. She had boarded the plane dismissed and diminished. She would step off it as the fulcrum upon which an empire turned. The plane touched down with a soft thud, the tires kissing the runway. The cabin filled with the sounds of movement bins opening, bags shuffled, passengers eager to disembark. Maya remained seated, calm, her carry-on bag neatly at her feet. She waited until the aisle cleared before standing, her posture graceful, unhurried. Karen watched her, just briefly, as she stepped into the aisle. There was something in her gaze confusion, perhaps even suspicion, as though she sensed, without understanding, that she had underestimated the woman in 2A. Maya didn't look back. She walked down the jet bridge, into the bustle of Charles de Gaulle Airport, the noise of announcements, the rush of travelers, the hum of a city waking up surrounded her. She moved through it all with quiet purpose, a single suitcase trailing behind her. In London, Richard Halden's jet cut through the night sky, racing to meet her. He clutched a folder in his lap, filled with emergency proposals drafted by his exhausted legal team, concessions, apologies, promises of reform, all weapons of a man who had already lost but didn't yet know the depth of his defeat. He stared out the window at the dark ocean below, imagining the woman on the other flight. He had never met her, but already he hated her power, feared her resolve, and yet he also knew that only she could save him now. As Maya cleared passport control in Paris, her phone buzzed gently in her bag. She retrieved it, glancing at the screen. Messages from Jordan, updates on the chaos, confirmation that Aerodyne Systems had indeed collapsed as predicted, confirmation that calls from Richard Halden had gone unanswered, redirected into silence. Maya smiled faintly, slipping the phone back into her bag. She hailed a taxi outside the terminal, the crisp Parisian air filling her lungs. The city stretched before her, timeless and beautiful, unaware that it was now the backdrop for a reckoning that would ripple across the globe. In London, the Aerodyne Board convened their emergency call, voices sharp with blame and desperation. Shareholders threatened revolt. Airlines threatened lawsuits. Executives scrambled for explanations. And through it all, one name repeated again and again. Dr. Maya Ellington, on the ground in Paris. She sat quietly in the back seat of a taxi, watching the streets blur past. She was not triumphant. She was not vengeful. She was resolute. The wheels of justice had been set in motion, and she was their axis. By the time Richard's jet touched down in London, the world would already know. And when he finally stood before her, hours later, it would not be as a CEO negotiating from strength. It would be as a man begging the woman he had underestimated to spare what remained of his empire. For now. Maya leaned back, her hands folded in her lap, the city of Paris welcoming her with its morning light. The storm raged elsewhere. She had done her part, and she was ready for what came next. The city of London woke under a sky of gray clouds, the Thames winding its way past towers of steel and glass that glittered with the first light of morning. For most, it was another weekday, another hum of traffic and rushing footsteps. But inside the Clarendon Hotel, tucked into the heart of Mayfair, history was preparing to pivot. Maya Ellington sat in a velvet armchair in the hotel bar, a porcelain cup of tea in her hands. She had chosen the spot deliberately private enough to keep prying eyes away, public enough to remind her guest that he was not in control. The bar was quiet, its polished wood gleaming, the air faint with the scent of citrus polish and fresh flowers. It was a place of calm dignity, a fitting stage for the moment ahead. She sipped her tea slowly, her posture unhurried. To anyone watching, she looked like a guest enjoying her morning, her carry-on bag discreetly tucked by her feet. But inside, she was measured steel. She had set the terms simply. Richard Halden would meet her here at 10 o'clock. 5 minutes, no more. That was all she offered. At precisely 9:58, the glass doors swung open. Richard Halden entered with the gait of a man who was usually obeyed without question, but now walked beneath the weight of desperation. His suit was impeccable but rumpled from travel, his tie askew, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion. He had not slept. He could not. He scanned the room and found her instantly. For a moment, he froze. The woman in the armchair did not radiate wealth or aggression. She was not surrounded by lawyers or bodyguards. She sat alone, calm, sipping tea. And yet Richard felt as though he had stepped into an arena with an opponent who had already defeated him. "Dr. Ellington," he said, his voice rough, betraying nerves he was unaccustomed to. Maya gestured to the chair across from her. "Mr. Halden, please, sit." He obeyed, lowering himself into the chair. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his hands clasped tightly as though holding himself together. "Thank you for meeting me," he began, his tone urgent, stripped of pretense. Maya raised a hand, stopping him. "You asked for 5 minutes. I will give you 10. Use them wisely." Richard swallowed hard. His instinct was to argue, to assert control, but the look in her eyes silenced him. They were steady, sharp, unwavering. He was not negotiating with a supplier. He was sitting across from the woman who had dismantled his empire overnight. "What happened on that flight was unacceptable," he said quickly, "unforgivable. I want to be clear. Aerodyne does not condone discriminatory behavior. Those employees do not represent us. I am here to apologize, personally, for the way you were treated." Maya said nothing. She lifted her cup, took another measured sip, then set it back on its saucer with a soft clink. The silence stretched, forcing him to fill it. "My company is in chaos," Richard admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "Airlines are furious. Stockholders are panicking. We are bleeding millions every hour. I am not here to make excuses. I am here to ask you, beg you, what I need to do to make this right. Tell me what it takes, and I will do it." Maya leaned back, her gaze unwavering. For a moment, she let the silence weigh on him. The sound of clinking glassware in the bar, the only interruption. Then she spoke, her voice quiet but cutting. "What I want, Mr. Halden, is for you to understand. What happened on that flight was not about fish or beef or risotto. It was about dignity. Your employees looked at me and decided I did not belong. They lied. They threatened me. And then they wrote that lie into an official record. They believed I was powerless to challenge them. They were wrong." Richard opened his mouth, but she continued before he could speak. "You built your company on my technology. My science made your empire possible. And yet, the very people serving your clients treated me like an intruder in a seat I paid for. That is not just an insult. That is a rot at the core of your culture." Richard's throat tightened. He could not deny it. "Not here. Not now. I know," he said softly. "You're right. I allowed it to fester. And now I will do whatever it takes to correct it." Maya studied him, her expression unreadable. She leaned forward, her voice low, deliberate. "Correction is not an apology in a press release. It is not a suspension for appearances. Correction must be systemic, permanent, visible." Richard nodded, desperation flickering in his eyes. "Then tell me what you want. Name it, and it will be done." Maya's eyes sharpened. "First, the individuals responsible are to be terminated immediately, not suspended, not reassigned, terminated, with cause documented as discriminatory misconduct. Their names will not vanish quietly into transfers. They will be marked for what they chose to be." Richard hesitated only for a second before nodding. "Consider it done. I'll call Global Skies myself. Second," she continued, "your company will implement mandatory diversity and inclusion training across every level. Not a hollow slideshow. A real program, designed by experts, rigorous, repeated, enforced. Every employee, from kitchen staff to senior executives, will complete it. And so will every flight attendant working with your partner airlines." Richard's mouth opened, then closed again. The cost would be astronomical, the logistics nightmarish. But he nodded. "Yes, we'll do it." "Third," Maya said, her voice unwavering, "Aerodyne will fund an endowment, a foundation in my name, the Dr. Maya Ellington Fellowship for Women of Color in STEM. You profited from my intellect while diminishing my person. Now your resources will build pathways for those who come after me. It will be substantial. 8 figures, non-negotiable." Richard's face blanched. 8 figures. Tens of millions. But there was no space for protest. "Agreed," he whispered. "Fourth," Maya said, her tone harder, "your complaint system will be rebuilt. No more burying passenger grievances under paperwork and excuses. Any complaint involving discrimination, bias, or harassment will bypass your chain of command entirely. It will be investigated by an independent unit. Transparent, accountable, binding." Richard's hands shook slightly, but he nodded again. "Yes." Maya leaned back once more, her eyes steady on his. "When all this is done, when the terminations are confirmed, The contracts signed, the funds transferred, the programs established. Only then will Nutravita reinstate your license. Until then, your empire remains frozen. That is my price, and it is not negotiable. Richard sat back, his breath ragged. He had come prepared to bargain, to offer money, to plead. Instead, he had been handed terms of surrender. Yet beneath the humiliation, he felt something else: relief. She had given him a path forward, brutal, costly, humbling, but a path nonetheless. He lowered his head briefly, then lifted it again, his voice raw. "It will be done." Maya studied him for another long moment, then picked up her cup once more. She took a slow sip of her tea. The clink of porcelain on porcelain echoed like a gavel. "Good," she said softly. Richard exhaled, sagging into his chair. For the first time in his career, he was not the man holding the power. And across from him, the woman he had underestimated sat calm, resolute, unbroken. The storm had not ended. It had only begun, but the balance of power was now set. Richard Holden left the Clarendon Hotel bar with the weight of a condemned man. He had come hoping for a reprieve, perhaps even mercy. Instead, he carried with him a set of terms that were as sharp and unyielding as a blade. He had agreed to them because he had no other choice. Now the true test would be in carrying them out. The first step came quickly. Within an hour of leaving Maya's presence, Richard was on a secure call with the CEO of Global Skies, his voice stripped of its usual arrogance. "You have 2 employees on Flight 482, Richard said, his tone low but urgent. A flight attendant named Karen Whitmore and a purser named Charles Grant. They are to be terminated immediately. Not suspended, not reassigned. Terminated, with documentation citing gross misconduct and discriminatory behavior." The airline CEO sputtered in disbelief. "You can't just—" "I can." Richard cut him off sharply, his voice hardening. "And I will, if you don't comply. Aerodyne will withdraw entirely from your fleet. Every single one of your long-haul flights will lose premium service overnight. Do you understand what that would mean?" There was a pause on the line, heavy with the realization of what was at stake. Then came the reluctant response: "Fine. It will be done." By late afternoon, the notices were drafted, signed, and delivered. Karen and Charles were called separately into small, sterile offices at Heathrow. Each expected perhaps a warning, perhaps a suspension. Instead, they were handed termination papers with language so stark it left them reeling. Gross misconduct, documented discrimination, effective immediately. Karen stared at the sheet in disbelief, her hands trembling. "This is ridiculous. I didn't do anything wrong." She was the one making a scene. The HR officer across from her said nothing, his eyes flat with exhaustion. He had been instructed not to argue, not to explain, only to execute. Charles reacted with indignation, his face flushing. "I've been with this company 20 years. You're firing me over one passenger complaint again." No reply. Just the paper, the signatures, the finality of a career ended not with applause, but with a cold stamp of failure. Both left the building in stunned silence. Their uniforms surrendered, their ID cards confiscated. Their names, once just lines on a roster, were now etched in disgrace across an industry that had no room for them anymore. Meanwhile, Richard's team scrambled to fulfill the next condition. His CFO nearly fainted when he saw the draft of the fellowship fund. Tens of millions earmarked for a foundation that bore Maya's name, the Dr. Maya Ellington, Fellowship for Women of Color in STEM. It wasn't just money. It was a symbol, a permanent reminder that their downfall had birthed a movement larger than any of them. Lawyers drafted documents at a pace that made their hands ache, reshaping contracts, creating clauses, building the skeleton of the independent complaint system Maya had demanded. They debated, they argued, but ultimately, they obeyed. Richard had been clear there would be no shortcuts, no attempts to water down her terms. She had left him no wiggle room. In Paris, Maya watched it all unfold from a quiet hotel suite overlooking the Seine. Her phone buzzed periodically with updates from Jordan Lee, each message short, precise, confirming that her demands were being carried out exactly as specified. Karen and Charles terminated, fellowship fund established, with initial transfer pending, complaint unit under construction, legal team compliant, training program consultants engaged, framework approved. Maya read each message with the same calm detachment with which she had typed her command the night before. She did not gloat. She did not rejoice. She simply acknowledged the progress and moved on. That night, she walked along the river, the air cool, the city lights reflecting on the water. Paris was alive with laughter and music, couples strolling hand in hand, children running along cobblestones. To them, the storm raging in boardrooms and airports was invisible. To her, it was a quiet symphony of justice. She paused on a bridge, her hands resting lightly on the stone railing. She thought again of her mother, of her father, of all the people who had endured indignities without the power to fight back. She thought of the girl at the science fair, of the young student at the podium, of all the moments when she had been told she didn't belong. Tonight, she knew she had carved space not only for herself, but for those who would come after. In London, Richard sat hunched over a conference table, his tie loosened, his face pale. The board members glared at him through video screens, their voices sharp with blame. "You've destroyed shareholder value." One barked, 40% gone in 2 days. Billions wiped out. You capitulated to one woman, another accused. You didn't even fight. Richard's jaw tightened. He thought of Maya's eyes, calm and unblinking, her terms laid out with surgical precision. Fight. There had been no fight. There had only been survival. "I did what was necessary," he said quietly. "Without her, we are nothing. You may not see it now, but in time you will understand. This wasn't capitulation. It was correction." The word hung in the room, strange on his tongue. Correction. It was hers, not his. But even as he said it, a part of him knew it was true. At JFK, a young flight attendant began training under the newly minted program that bore Maya's name. The sessions were grueling, emotional, eye-opening. They didn't just teach policy. They forced staff to confront bias, to recognize microaggressions, to see passengers not as demographics, but as human beings with dignity. One trainee wiped tears from her eyes during a role-play exercise, realizing for the first time how subtle cruelty could feel like a blade. Another raised his hand to admit he had once brushed off a passenger's concern, thinking it trivial, when in reality it was a wound he had deepened. The Dubois Protocol, as the staff nicknamed it, was not easy, but it was necessary. And slowly, it began to change the culture. Back in Paris, Maya sat at her desk, reading the final draft of the fellowship's charter. Her name was there in bold letters, tied forever to a fund that would lift women into spaces where once they had been told they did not belong. It was not revenge. It was legacy. She signed her approval, her hand steady. The foundation was born. The next morning, newspapers across the world splashed headlines across their front pages. Aerodyne in free fall after license suspension. CEO Halden surrenders to terms. set by scientists. From Seat 2A to Global Reckoning, How One Woman Reshaped Aviation. Maya read them over breakfast, her tea steaming gently beside her. She felt no triumph, only a quiet satisfaction. The story had grown beyond her, beyond one flight, beyond one insult. It was now about accountability, about culture, about the future. For Karen and Charles, the world had shrunk. No airline would hire them. No catering company would take the risk. They were whispered about as cautionary tales, examples of arrogance that had destroyed more than just their own careers. They had been symbols of entitlement. Now they were warnings etched into industry memory. For Richard, the days ahead were still grim. He would fight lawsuits, rebuild partnerships, answer to furious shareholders. But somewhere deep inside, he knew that Maya Ellington had given him something more valuable than mercy. She had given him truth. And for Maya, the journey was only beginning. Her fellowship would open doors, her protocol would change lives, and her quiet act of resistance would echo long after Flight 482 was forgotten by most. But she would remember. She would always remember. Because justice, once awakened, does not sleep again. The storm had passed, but its echoes remained. Weeks after Flight 482 touched down in Paris, the reverberations of Dr. Maya Ellington's actions were still shaking boardrooms and airports across the globe. What had begun as a simple denial of a meal at 30,000 feet had spiraled into a reckoning that no one could ignore. In London, Aerodyne Global limped forward. Humbled and reshaped, the company had survived, though only just. Richard Halden sat in his corner office overlooking the Thames. The same man, but not the same leader. His hair seemed grayer, his face more lined. His empire, once untouchable, had been remade under the iron terms dictated in a hotel bar. The Fellowship Fund had already transferred its first grants, names of young women appearing on letters that bore Maya's signature. In New York, a high school senior named Tiana opened hers with trembling hands. She had dreamed of studying chemical engineering, but feared she could never afford it. Now, with the Ellington Fellowship, her path was clear. Her eyes filled with tears as she read the words, "We believe in your future." At JFK, the new training program rolled out. Rows of flight attendants sat in classrooms, notebooks open, expressions wary but attentive. They had been warned this was no ordinary training. Instructors led them through scenarios, forced them to confront biases, to see how a casual dismissal or a careless smirk could wound deeper than they imagined. Some resisted at first, muttering about political correctness. But as the sessions went on, walls began to crack. A young man admitted he had once judged a passenger by their clothes, assuming they didn't belong in first class. A woman confessed that she often favored those who looked like her, without realizing it. Tears were shed, voices trembled, and slowly, a culture began to shift. The program became known as the Ellington Protocol, a phrase that carried both respect and a quiet weight. To fail, it was to fail at humanity itself. For Karen Whitmore and Charles Grant, the fallout was swift and merciless. They had become names whispered with disdain, examples of arrogance that had cost billions. Karen applied to regional airlines, to charter companies, to luxury travel firms. Each rejection came back colder than the last. Charles tried to pivot into corporate roles, but no one wanted the man whose report had ignited the fury of Dr. Maya Ellington. Their downfall was complete. They had believed themselves untouchable. They had been wrong. And through it all, Maya moved quietly forward. She had not sought headlines, but they found her anyway. Journalists called her the woman who grounded Aerodyne. Editorials praised her dignity, her precision, her refusal to accept humiliation and silence. She declined interviews, allowing the facts to speak louder than any soundbite. In Paris, she returned to her work, attending the conference she had originally traveled for, speaking to colleagues who greeted her with awe thinly veiled behind professional respect. Some whispered that she had changed the industry forever. Others admitted openly that they admired her courage. One evening, weeks later, Maya sat by the window of her apartment, overlooking the Seine. The fellowship's website glowed on her laptop screen, names of recipients filling the page. She scrolled slowly, her eyes softening at each new student who would walk a path she had once walked alone. She thought of her younger self, standing on a stage at a science fair, her experiment dismissed until it was undeniable. She thought of her mother's words, the warnings and encouragement interwoven. She closed her laptop, setting it aside. The night was quiet, the hum of the city a gentle background. She wrapped herself in a blanket, holding a cup of tea. The world had changed, and she had been its catalyst. But for her, it was not about victory. It was about balance restored, about dignity defended, about a culture corrected. In London, Richard Halden addressed his board once more. He looked around at the faces of men and women who had once feared nothing but profit margins. Now, they feared something deeper, accountability. "We lost billions," he admitted, his voice steady, almost resigned. "But we gained a lesson we cannot afford to forget. Our power was never absolute. It was borrowed, and it was built on the work of others, work we disrespected, work we diminished. That is over now." Some board members shifted uncomfortably, but none challenged him. They knew the truth. In airports across the world, small changes began to show. A flight attendant offered extra care to a nervous passenger. A purser documented an incident of bias with honesty rather than deflection. A culture that had once brushed aside complaints now paused, listened, and acted. The legend of Flight 482 spread quietly but steadily. Not every detail was known, not every truth revealed, but within the industry, the story was clear. One passenger had toppled a giant, not with fury, but with precision. One act of quiet dignity had rewritten the rules. Months later, on a trans-Pacific flight from Los Angeles to Tokyo, a young flight attendant named Sarah found herself in a familiar situation. An elderly passenger struggled to lift her bag into the overhead bin. A businessman behind her sighed loudly, impatient, muttering about delays. Sarah stepped forward, smiling warmly. "Let me help you with that, ma'am," she said, lifting the bag with ease. Then she turned to the businessman, her voice calm but firm. "Thank you for your patience, sir. May I offer you a drink on the house once we're in the air?" The tension dissolved instantly. The elderly passenger smiled with relief. The businessman nodded with surprise, mollified. It was a small act, ordinary, almost forgettable, but it was proof. The culture was changing. The lessons of Flight 482 lived on. Back in Paris, Maya received an email notification. It was a message from one of the fellowship recipients, a young woman studying engineering in Chicago, Dr. Ellington. The email read, "I just wanted to thank you. Without your fellowship, I would never have been able to pursue my dream. You've given me not just funding, but belief. I hope one day I can change the world, the way you did." Maya read the words twice, her eyes glistening. She typed a simple reply. "You don't have to change the world. Just refuse to let it change you. That will be enough." She pressed send, leaned back, and let the quiet of the evening wash over her. The world remembered her as the woman who had brought Aerodyne to its knees, as the scientist who had turned dignity into leverage. But for Maya Ellington, it was simpler. She had been told she didn't belong. She had answered with truth. She had been denied a meal. She had fed a movement, and somewhere above the clouds, in the hushed quiet of a first-class cabin, justice still lingered, not as vengeance, but as transformation, justice that would not be forgotten. What began as a plate of food withheld ended as a cultural earthquake. Dr. Maya Ellington didn't shout, didn't fight with rage. She responded with precision, with quiet dignity, with the kind of strength that rewrites systems. Her stand against prejudice forced an entire industry to confront its blind spots. The attendants who dismissed her lost their careers. The company that profited from her intellect was humbled, and countless young women of color now have doors opened for them through a fellowship that will echo for generations. This story reminds us of something vital. Injustice may try to diminish us in small, ordinary moments. But if we refuse to bend, if we hold firm to dignity, even a whisper can bring down walls built on arrogance. As you leave this story, ask yourself, how would you have acted if you had witnessed what happened in Seat 2A? Would you have looked away or stood up? If this tale moved you, if you believe dignity should never be negotiable, then honor it like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. More stories of truth, justice, and transformation are coming, and you won't want to miss the next one.